Well, welcome everybody to the Steel Center discussion. I'm Jamie Dow. I teach in philosophy. If you've not been here before, this is Ellis Hall. And in Ellis Hall, the philosophy department and the religious studies department teach and have their offices upstairs. And then also we have Steel Center events here, discussions on Wednesdays, sometimes speakers, and sometimes book groups. So, go on Hendrix today, look for Steel Center events. And if you have any questions about the Steel Center, just let me know. And today I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Michael Norton, who's a professor of philosophy from UALR and also the associate dean of the College of Humanities, Social Sciences, Arts, Education, and other things. Is it the Department of Human Inquiry?
School of Human.
In the School of Human Inquiry. And he's published a book called Anthropocene Religion with University of Edinburgh Press, right? So let's congratulate him on that. That's coming up. So this is his book release party in a sense. And I'm very grateful to Michael for sharing his research. It's always great to hear about forms of religious pluralism. That's something he's written a lot about. He's written an article on religious pluralism. If you're interested in that, I could send it to you. And today he's going to be talking about Anthropocene religion. So let's welcome Dr. Michael Norton.
Thank you. Let me get going now. I'm going to put the mask on. I've been traveling a little bit, and there are a lot of you here, and I know Thanksgiving's coming up, so I don't want to, just in case, spoil anybody's plans. But if anybody has any trouble hearing me, just interrupt, and I'll try to project more. All right, thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. As you said, my book, Anthropocene Religion, is coming out in February. My aim in that book, in short, is to propose a reconceptualization of religion in the context of the environmental crises which we're already living through. I will say, as a side, when I say reconceptualization of religion, what I'm interested in is philosophy of religion in the sense of asking the philosophical question of what religion is, what is its nature and role in the world, how should we understand that concept? So I begin in that book by outlining the contemporary context that the term Anthropocene signifies before examining some of the problems inherent in received and mostly modern concepts of nature, and suggest that if we retain this concept of nature, we ought to imbue it with a sense of dynamism, creativity, interrelationality, and precarity. And after also exploring several problems in traditional Western understandings of religion, I try to offer a philosophical approach to this idea informed in part by the prior discussion of nature and the Anthropocene. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is one example on which I draw of a way, or really like a set of ways, of thinking about both nature and humanity differently than the ways determined largely by modern Western metaphysics and epistemology. And it's an example that I take to be particularly informative and fruitful for thinking about what we call religion very differently. And that set of ways is what anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro calls Amerindian perspectivism. I brought these as sort of visual aids. These are two of Viveiros de Castro's books, Cannibal Metaphysics, and one that he co-authored with Deborah Danowski, The Ends of the World, where he explicitly talks about Indigenous American perspectives, context of the Anthropocene. Since the word religion came into its modern usage, the ways that philosophers have understood what it is, what it does, what role it plays in society have been dominated by a particular model of humanity and of divinity. One which sets each of those in their own way apart from a natural world that is rendered subject to them. This can be typified by what we might familiarly understand as the monotheistic model of a God who exists in some way or other beyond the world and whose nature is uniquely reflected in humanity by virtue either of our reason or our will or something that we understand as somehow again, reflective of the transcendent God. And on another aside, I lay out some reasons in a different part of my book why I'm using this term monotheist or monotheistic. It can be a little bit misleading. So please ask me questions about that at the end if you have them. But this model, this monotheistic model, which is by no means the only one offered by the historical monotheist religions. It's worth noting the sort of Abrahamic traditions, they have a lot of diversity within them, but this particular model of the transcendent, unique God has become sort of uniquely influential, especially in the modern West. You might be familiar with this short essay published in 1967 by Lynn White called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, where he makes it's very short, I wouldn't say makes an argument, makes a claim about the influence that Christianity in particular, Christian theology has had on the way that modern Western civilization has approached nature in, destructive ways. I will say my first reading of that essay, I felt like, oh, this is this. I don't know about this. It's short, it's a little bit simplistic. I actually think there's some interesting things to his claim. I do think it's a little bit oversimplified. But actually, that connection between this, again, sort of dominant model of the transcendent monotheist God, humanity as a kind of intermediary between that God and nature, and then nature is subject to the dominion of God and of humanity. And the effects for the way that we then go about existing within our environments. I think that's a fairly powerful thing to recognize. But rather than belabor on this, let me turn as a contrast to the description of Indigenous American cosmology and perspectivism provided in the work of Viveiros de Castro. So Viveiros de Castro emphasizes the lack in this general form of indigenous cosmology that he examined, sort of takes examples from various Central and South American cultures and syncretizes them into this overarching what he called Amerindian perspectivism. He emphasized the lack of a division between humans and the other than human world, that kind of division that's implied or imposed by the monotheistic model. Viveiros de Castro writes, if there is a virtually universal Amerindian notion, it is that of an original state of undifferentiation between humans and animals, described in mythology. And this undifferentiated state is not one in which humans have yet to separate themselves from the animal or natural world in order to become human as such, but rather the opposite. The original common condition of both humans and animals is not animality, but rather humanity. That is, pattern that he sees across various mythologies of Indigenous American cultures is or an original state in which everything that exists is human. So as he explains in more detail in this book co-written with Deborah Danowski, many Indigenous American cosmogonies posit a mythological prehistory in which the only beings were human, but humans in a state of chaotic and metamorphic flux. It was out of this flux that the multitude of different kinds of beings eventually emerged and settled into the forms in which we know them today. And the aim of much Indigenous ritual practice is oriented towards regulating change in the world so that we don't slip back into that flux. The regular transformations of the world are the source of sense and meaning. They continue to orient the community as such. However, the regular transformations of the world also represent the potential danger of the world regressing into the chaos of the mythological beginning. Now, in this book, The Things of the World, Danowski and Viveiros de Castro call this perspective anthropomorphism, and they contrast it with anthropocentrism. The latter, anthropocentrism, places humans at the center of the cosmos precisely by maintaining that humans and whatever is characteristic of human society or culture or reason or language are unique, right? And set apart from the rest of nature. So humans are at the center and everything else is separate and related or defined in relation to us. In other words, anthropocentrism is part and parcel of the cosmological hierarchy of what I call the monotheistic model. Indigenous anthropomorphism, by contrast, posits no essential difference between humans and other than humans, since the wide variety of types of other than human living beings, and even some non-living entities in some cases, like mountains or rivers, began their existence as human. Indeed, humans only perceive the other beings in their environment as not human due to our own perspective. Hence the designation of this ontology as perspectivism. Viveiros de Castro explains that according to this perspectivism, each being sees itself and those like it as human, and those unlike it as some class of other than human. So, in his words, quote, typically in normal conditions, humans see humans as humans, animals as animals, spirits, if they see them, as spirits. However, animals, let's say predators, and spirits see humans as animals, that is, as prey, to the same extent that animals, as prey, see humans as spirits or as predators. By the same token, animals and spirits see themselves as humans, etc. End quote. This view is a type of anthropomorphism precisely because it extends the concept of humanity to each and every being, but only from each being's own perspective. So I think it's important to note two things. First, Viveiros de Castro is careful to point out that the Indigenous American words typically translated as human being don't refer to human beings as a kind of natural species. We're not talking about sapiens. This is perhaps to be expected given that the ontological condition of humanity is taken in these accounts to be much more widely distributed than merely among the genus of primates known as Homo sapiens. Words translated as human refer more properly to the social condition of personhood, and they function, he says, pragmatically when not syntactically, less as nouns and more as pronouns. In other words, humanity is simply taken as subject. The human is the being that can be a subject for its own perspective. And to say that other than humans are humans or people or persons is to attribute to them, quote, the capacities of conscious intentionality and agency which define the position of the subject. So this indigenous anthropomorphic ontology extends subjectivity, or at least the capacity for subjectivity, broadly beyond the confines of humans as a species. It posits subjectivity as a fundamental characteristic of being, insofar as it posits humanity as the mythological origin condition from which all beings emerged. Yet, and this is the second point, we ought not understand this fundamental subjectivity as a kind of higher order ontological or existential condition of which humanity is such. It's just one particular manifestation. There's a reason that Janowski and Viveiros de Castro call this worldview anthropomorphic. The subjectivity or personhood extended to what we recognize as other than human beings remains humanity, even from the perspective of beings, right? This is evident, again, in humans' mythological role as the sole original beings, or in some cases, as at least one of very few sole original beings, from which the entire wide variety of beings capable of having their own perspective descends. That is, everything is human because everything was human in the beginning. This kind of subjectivity that animals, spirits, and even mountains or rivers possess is taken to be the same kind of subjectivity that we Homo sapiens possess. As Viveiros de Castro explicitly notes, therefore, the anthropomorphism of Indigenous American Perspectivism does not consist of metaphorical projection of human qualities onto other than human beings. It consists of attributing to other than human beings the same self-referential dispositions attributed to humans. Now, in what he originally, or earlier, I think, calls animism before he decides to reject that term, Viveiros de Castro notes that the relationship between humans and other than humans within this framework is a social one. Social, or we could say political, because these relationships are fundamental to every aspect of Indigenous American perspectivism. So this animistic or later anthropomorphic ontology entails relational understandings of both subjectivity and of the world, because the world is populated with an immense variety of beings who each from their own perspective are human persons. There's no natural environment that stands outside the space of social and political interaction. Human society is not qualitatively different, as the human society we're used to, right? Is not qualitatively different from the societies populated by, for example, jaguars or tapirs. Furthermore, both due to the perspectival nature of being and due to the chaotic, metamorphic original state of humanity from which all beings emerge, even what we commonly take to be individual beings are inherently plural. It's a long quote from Janowski and Viveiros de Castro. Each object or aspect of the universe is a hybrid entity, once human for itself and not human for an other, or rather by an. In this sense, every existing being and the world as open aggregate of existing beings is a being outside of itself. There is no being in itself or being qua being that does not depend on its being as other. Every being is being by, being for, being relation. So in there, Janowski and Viveiros de Castro are describing a lived, embodied, practical ontology exhibited by peoples for whom nature and culture are not and have not ever been distinct, or more precisely, for whom the entire world is and has always been cultural. Indigenous American ontology is thus a kind of reverse image of modern European ontology, where the latter posits nature as a single, homogeneous substrate on which a multiplicity of cultures and perspectives stand. That is a mono-naturalism and a multiculturalism. The former, that is Indigenous American ontology, takes culture or humanity or personhood or subjectivity as the universal substrate shared by what emerges in embodiment as a multiplicity of natures. So there is a kind of monoculturalism where for every different type of being, the cultural forms are the same, forms of subjectivity are the same, but there is a multiplicity of natures because of the multiplicity of perspectives between these beings. So the modern European is multiculturalist but mononaturalist. The indigenous Amazonian, for instance, is monoculturalist but multinaturalist. Okay, so what does this have to do with how we think about religion? Well, it's interesting. Viveiros de Castro references spirits in his examinations of Indigenous American worldviews, but he really kind of avoids the term religion or spirituality also. There are a couple of places where he refers to the footnotes, but other than that, at least in what I've read, it doesn't really show up. He also doesn't seem to consider it necessary to integrate beliefs about and practices concerning divine beings into his account, except for the occasional reference to the function of a demiurge in the cosmogonic myths. But I take it that references to supramundane beings and forces, while often present in religious traditions, are not necessary for a good understanding of religion. That's a point I go into in a little more detail in the chapter of the book where I talk about religion. I suggest taking the term religion. This is a kind of provisional or heuristic definition, but I suggest taking the term religion to signify phenomena that demonstrate to some extent the following elements. One, material embodied practices of belief that emerge from, maintain, and produce. Two, affective tendencies and commitments that are entangled with. Three, individual and group identities as part of chains of memory, which is sort of stand-in phrase for traditions, which, or orient beings in space and time, with reference to agencies that include and relate to, but also may exceed the mundane. So just want to underline that point, that religions don't have to reference something like divine or supernatural beings. Often do, but it's not a necessary condition. Now, let me identify just a few aspects of what we've examined in Viveiros de Castro's account that I think would sanction us using Indigenous American perspectivism to inform what I'm calling an ecological approach to understanding religion in the Anthropocene. First, note that the perspectivist ontology here is practical. The relations in and through which each and every being is what it is are lived, embodied relations, not only between individuals, but within and between groups, understood as peoples, that is, socio-cultural identities. I'm going to emphasize here that those groups understood as peoples, right, aren't necessarily just different human social units, but we can think about the jaguars, right, as a social group, a group of people, right, a group of people, right, the tapir as a group of people. So, as I've already said, Danowski and Viveiros de Castro note that the aim of many ritual practices in Indigenous American cultures is to preserve the present arrangement of forms and to keep transformations within the world manageable. Put that otherwise, Indigenous perspectivist ontology is associated with and demonstrated through material embodied practices There's ritual practices that maintain individual and group identities and orient beings in space and time. In contrast to the monotheistic model that positions humans apart from and above other than humans, with reference to a transcendent divine, Indigenous American ontology and its associated practices place humans in relation with both the other than beings, other than human beings in their environment and the environment itself. At the same time, it distributes humanity beyond the limits of the species Homo sapiens, minimizing any essential differences, or maybe erasing any essential differences between various kinds of beings, according to which responsibilities or obligations between those beings would be reduced. If the social arena within which humans relate, not only with each other, but also with animals, plants, mountains, and with spirits, is a space in which each of these different kinds of beings has personhood from its own perspective, then ignoring the dignity of other kinds of beings necessarily becomes ethically, politically, and indeed religiously problematic. While Indigenous American practices and beliefs offer instructive examples of possibilities for understanding religion ecologically, there are certainly these are certainly not the only traditions within which such possibilities arise. I see this approach to religion in the Anthropocene as not prescriptive, but rather suggestive regarding particular religious commitments. I would argue that the potential for more ecological approaches to religious life is latent, if not already evident, in virtually all the traditions we recognize as religious. The issue I'm concerned with is how we should think about religion such that this potential might be realized. The recognition and development of conceptual and practical resources within diverse traditions for building religious commitments and practices that embrace pluralistic perspectival approaches to truth and to value must involve decentering the human perspective and acknowledging our interdependencies with and obligations to a variety of other than human beings and to the earth. And I'll just say here, it's part of the way that I examine the concept of the Anthropocene. I make the claim, and others have made this claim too, that despite its name, what the Anthropocene does is actually displace anthropocentrism. So the arrival of the Anthropocene as a kind of new, let's say geological epoch, although it's actually just rejected by the National Stratigraphic Commission, but as a new sort of situation in which we are living environmentally is in fact a decenter, sort of forces us to decenter ourselves from the way we think about the world. And as an implication that I think pushes us to acknowledge these kind of interdependencies that I'm talking about. The Belgian philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers, uses the idea of diplomacy to articulate an ecological, and she would use the word cosmopolitical approach that's very akin to the perspectivism Viveiros de Castro finds among the Indigenous American society he studies, and Danowski and Viveiros de Castro also draw on Stengers and Bruno Latour, who also is working with some of these same concepts. So Stengers writes, quote, "The diplomacy is much older than Christianity, and it celebrates another quite artificial is good for him, conception of truth. What is true is what succeeds in producing a communication between diverging parties," unquote. So in the context of Indigenous American perspectivism, where the diverging parties are not different groups of humans, but humans here, jaguars there, etc., we can take the figure of the shaman as the diplomat whose liminal position is able to produce communication. And it's by way of the extraordinary experience of the shaman, who is often understood to be able to shift forms from human to animal, and even to spirit, that is, to enter the realm of the dead. It's by way of that position that both the multiplicity of nature and the universality of the human subject position is made known to humans. By literally inhabiting the point of view of the other, the shaman is able to know and make known that, in Viveiros de Castro's words, the form of the other is the person, in contrast to the epistemological framework of the modern European, in which the form of the other is the object. So the implications of this for understanding religious practice, I think, are also evident in an example Stengers uses of contemporary neo-pagan ritual practices, which he describes as, quote, modes of gathering that make present, quote, something which transforms their relations to the states they have set up. In addition to both establishing and transforming relations between beings, these practices help enact belonging, that is, an identity and orientation in the world, which depend on the active maintenance of the relations that bring it into being. In the case of indigenous perspectivism, this relationality is manifest in a systematic and deliberate inference of agency and intentionality distributed throughout the world rather than limited to the space of the human. So this is to use some technical language, this is a very wide and kind of almost universal reduction of agency beyond human into all different kinds of beings. Such attribution of dynamic agential relationality is what I am calling an ecological approach. So now, returning again to that provisional outline of religion I employed, let me attempt to bring together the possibilities for understanding religion outside the framework of the monotheistic model in order to posit an approach to religion informed by this ecological outlook. So I've taken Indigenous American perspectivism as outlined by Viveiros de Castro as one possible touchstone for this outlook. Applying this to the provisional outline of religion I mentioned earlier, I posit that an ecological understanding of religion will not merely employ, but acknowledge and center the material embodied practices of belief that emerge from, maintain, and produce effective tendencies and commitments that build and uphold relations and interdependencies among humans and a diverse array of other than humans, which ground individual and group identities through chains of memory that establish individuals and groups as parts of a larger ecological, quote, society of societies. I think that's Stengers' phrase, within which beings are oriented in an ordered but dynamic spatiotemporal field with reference to agencies that may exceed the ordinary or mundane, but are nevertheless not posited as only and wholly transcendent. So such an approach, I think, will aid in bringing our understanding of religion within the horizon of the Anthropocene by meeting its demand for both a decentering of the human and relinquishing of the gap between the transcendent divine and the mundane world, posited by what I've been calling the monotheistic model. My contention is that the nature and role of religion in the Anthropocene needs to be primarily informed not by that monotheistic approach, as I argue the modern Western concepts of religion have been, but instead by more down-to-earth approaches. This shouldn't be understood as endorsing some kind of return to older forms or concepts of religion, nor as yet another distinction between true and false forms of religion. I think that would simply mimic the dichotomy posited by centuries of monotheistic conceptual hegemony. The unprecedented nature of the catastrophic climate change that is constitutive of the Anthropocene calls for the creation of not only new, but also, and I think more importantly, diverse and dynamic ways of assembling religious ideas, commitments, and practices. Thanks.
Who wants to start the conversation? Students first.
How do you see that playing out? How do you see a transition to this model you're proposing?
I mean, it's, that's a good question. Thank you. And in some ways, I think that I am maybe trying too much to sidestep this issue by saying, like, well, what I'm interested in is a philosophy of religion, right? So I'm trying to persuade us to think about religions differently, because I do think that in many ways, if we look at the way people in a broad variety of traditions practice, right, we already see these kinds of embodied relationships with the world and with each other that are more, again, ecological, to use my word, that's sometimes the ways we think about them. So my primary interest is discourse in and about religion. So answering that question just about the discourse, well, I think it's a matter of trying to find and emphasize examples or paradigms, right? So that's why I'm looking at this as one particular example to say, like, look, I think that for a long time, the dominant discourse in Western culture, anyway, about religion has seen it in this way that's typified not only by a Christian-centric model, but by a very specific understanding, a very specific theological, philosophical interpretation of this Christian model. And so I think that part of it is just a matter of introducing alternatives in our discourse. I think a lot of philosophers of religion, and particularly people who do theory of religion and religious studies, have started for the last few decades. So I think that's part of it, but I think a lot of it is political too. I mean, I think that when I say political, I mean having to do with political action. It'll have to do with not only engaging in political discourse actively in ways that make space for different ways of understanding this, but also maybe rearranging certain political relationships, political structures in ways that, again, make more space for both the discourse to change and for actions to match that discourse. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Maybe kind of a follow-up to that, but so I guess when you were describing this kind of what the change of this perspective would be of extending, to me, the idea of personhood, makes a lot of sense in relationship to things that I understand about how cosmologies work and the idea about that. But I guess just thinking about, what is then the ethical implications of that once you have personhood? The thing that I heard a little bit of what you were talking about, but thinking about when I've tried to understand what people are doing when they're practicing different kinds of ritual events, often one of the things that stand out to me is the idea of reciprocity, as the nature of the social relationship and the dynamic of the social relationship between persons and those other beings, those other than human persons. And so I guess, kind of thinking about what the political expression of that idea would be, you know, in terms of thinking about how we might change our ethics to think about, well, what, you know, what is he doing, you know, in relationship to this kind of person.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think that's right. I think that in a lot of cases, it would have to do with recognizing a kind of obligation or various kinds of obligations actually to beings toward whom we maybe haven't typically, at least in the last few hundred years in Western cultures, thought of as being obligated. Like we might have, we might think about, you know, having certain ethical duties towards at least kind of sort of weak welfare, right, in terms of like animal welfare, less so in terms of plants or the environment generally, and that's something that, you know, movements towards recognizing our responsibilities towards those more recently have been ramping up. But I think having the kind of obligation in terms of reciprocity we're talking about would in a lot of ways entail some major shifts in the way that our economy and our society is structured, as well as, and so this is an example from the person I mentioned earlier, Bruno Latour. I think he talks about this in his book Politics of Nature, where he also uses this term multinaturalism. But he talks about bringing beings into, what does he call it, the parliament of, I think it's the parliament of things is the phrase he uses. But he talks about, like, if we're talking about, say, the melting of the polar ice caps, right? He talks about the ways in which we can be responsive to what the ice caps are telling us. How can these kinds of natural beings, environmental processes or agents find a voice within our society or within this broader society of societies? That's the sort of shorthand for what Stengers calls the cosmopolitical situation, the cosmopoliteia, the parliament or the politics of the whole world, and just like the human. And it involves for Latour, of course, what he calls translation. You have to, can't just have a conversation with an iceberg or a penguin or something like that. This is part of Stephen Vogel's criticism of this. Vogel says, well, it's obvious that you can't literally have a conversation with a penguin. And I think Latour would say, don't be so sure, because every conversation involves some kind of translation. And then Latour has his sort of anthropology of the hard sciences would say, like, that's what we do when we do science, is we're translating this kind of data into this kind of data, into our analysis of that data, into the conclusions that we make. Those are all steps of translation. So we can broaden that process in such a way that we acknowledge and bring in more kinds of beings into our discussions, and we can create a space for something like kinds for recognizing and acting on the kind of obligations.
So I want to ask, when it comes to, like, I guess, agency and being, I feel like I guess inherently our idea of it is kind of rooted in like how humans interact with that. And I know, like, I guess the whole idea is to start extrapolating that and like seeing that in other like beings as like entities of any sort of nature. So I was just wondering, like, how could we, like, I guess, meaningfully like extrapolate agency to a being that we kind of don't share a lot of relation to? Because I know you talked about like I guess like reading the data of like natural scientists, but in terms of like I guess like how do we continue that like with other types of beings and like use that information in order to, I guess, act in like a meaningful, like ethical way? That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean it is a little bit difficult, right, or a little puzzling because number one, we're not used to thinking this way, right? But also, despite all sort of universalizing language that I mentioned, and even that Viveiros de Castro uses sometimes, in any of the examples that he's looking at, it's not going to be the case that every person, right? But it's just the case that there are much broader variety of forms of beings that are taken to be persons or from their own perspective humans. But for those that are, you would say, you know, the people of the cultures who have this ontology, they mean that literal. Like they mean that the jaguar sees itself literally as a human and sees humans literally as maybe equivalent to tapir or some other kind of prey. For it's the predator-prey relationship is actually real fundamental in this, which also has a sort of dark side because it means that sometimes humans don't see other humans as humans, but as prey. Yeah, so the question is so like, how do we actually get to that? Like, how do we see that? And I think that, to me anyway, the practice would just be like, it's almost a kind of generosity, right? That when we encounter other beings in whom we can see potentially, right, a kind of trace of an agency and intentionality that we experience in ourselves from the first person perspective, that we assume that they experience themselves in the same way, not unlike the way we do with just other people, right? Because we don't see the world from the perspective of other humans, yet we relate to them as if they are subjects deserving the respect, right, that we expect for ourselves, and towards whom we then have certain kind of ethical obligations. Now, again, like I said, it's a little bit difficult, and there's kind of a dark side to this, right? Because he's not making the argument, and he's not saying that, you know, a member of an Amazonian tribe, for instance, would make the argument that therefore we as humans shouldn't hunt tapirs, or I think they would take it for granted that of course they should, because they are prey from humans' perspective, right? I think that is something that we can continue to sort of wrestle with as an ethical question. Like, well, what is the extent to which, when we encounter other kinds of beings, right, they deserve particular kinds of treatment? But I think being able to ask that question within the framework of acknowledging other beings as at least potentially agential, right, a subject in themselves, casts the question differently, right? And I also get the sense that, again, from the perspective of the Indigenous American cultures that this approach is coming from, that even in that predator-prey relationship, right, that there is a certain kind of respect and that there are certain obligations that are upheld, such that the sorts of, and this is me sort of extrapolating this, such like the sorts of industrial agriculture and other sorts of practices that we in our cultures have engaged in the last couple of hundred years would be sort of anathema, right? precisely because they are destructive of the social framework
Mhm.
of these other kinds of beings, right? In a way that we should be able to recognize based on our participation in our own society as wrong.
Does this have the ability to give agency to, let's say, like a rock? And then maybe possibly related is, you mentioned mononaturalism and multiculturalism, it's sort of a monotheistic, correct me if I'm misinterpreting. And then the flip, the multinaturalism and monoculturalism is what you're suggesting here. What would a like multinaturalism, multiculturalism look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so for your first question about like, are we saying it would be possible to attribute agency to something like a rod? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but it's not just like a decision we make. It depends on a whole set of cultural and symbolic relations that would have to sort of undergird that. But yeah, okay, so about sort of combining multiculturalism with multinaturalism. One possible response to say like, well, that actually might not work, be so chaotic, right? There's nothing that sort of serves as a ground. I think I'm a little more optimistic, actually, that something like that could be built up. And I think particularly about the work that Stengers does in her philosophy and history of science, because what she's interested in doing is in this context that she talks about this sort of cosmopolitical approach or cosmopolitical questions, what she calls it sometimes. But in her 2-volume work, it's actually 7 volumes for the French, but they combined them into just 2 for the English version. It's called Cosmopolitics. What she does is she sort of goes back through the history of the development of modern science and sort of various different problems in different fields that were addressed at different times, looking at them as these kinds of not competitions exactly, but these situations in which what we have taken to understand as the scientific truth, right, or the scientific fact, was at some point sort of up in the air, and different perspectives and different approaches were vying in this in interesting discursive ways for dominance. And what she tries to illustrate, I think, is the ways in which these things aren't simply settled by reference to some objective thing that is out there in the world, right? The sort of the mono nature that's just the given, right? It's what it is, but it's settled by this sort of, again, what she calls this sort of diplomatic back and forth between different parties to reach a kind of consensus in which one, paradigm, to use Kuhn's word, is established, and then everything outside of that is discarded. But she says we have to understand the ways in which this is all, it's kind of, there's a discursive diversity at some point, and these consensuses are settled by the give and take that are precarious, right? And they do involve kinds of creativity, not only in thinking, but in interacting with the world. I think that it probably is possible to arrange a kind of situation where that kind of diversity and dynamism can be operative about the natural world and about whether you call it culture or the subject perspective or personhood, right, at the same time, in ways that would allow for even sort of interplay and exchange of positions between these two. But I think it's hard. I mean, I think that would take a lot of work. I think it's far from where we are. I think though that again, that's sort of what I'm interested in thinking about and doing, particularly in the context of religion. Right. I think that is precisely why religion is interesting to me, because I think religion is the way in which, at least for a lot of people, sense of self, our sense of identity within a group and belonging, our sense of place in the world, history is established. And so to be able to understand that in a way that's not just given from somewhere outside of the world, but that is established and needs to be constantly maintained and can be reevaluated and accommodate a diversity of viewpoints, is something that I think is beneficial. And that's what, like, I said earlier, the monotheist is not the best term. I think even in the context where I am able to explain this a little bit better in the book, I still don't think it's the best term. But the contrast to that, the contrasting term would not be polytheist, because actually what characterizes monotheism, and this taking this from an Egyptologist named Jan Osman, what characterizes monotheism is not the number of gods, but the relationship between God and world. Right? So the contrast to what I'm calling monotheist model here would not be polytheist, but would be what Osman calls cosmotheist. So the emphasis is on a kind of sort of immanence and worldliness of however we understand the supermundane.
Quick one. It seems like the personhood as we experience it in other beings is sort of self-evident in this way, that if you have a pet or if you form a relationship with a plant or things like that. And so the tendency in humans to ignore or deprive other beings, human and non-human alike, of their personhood is an economic decision. And I think that in Amerindian perspectivism, that is also based on a kind of economy, like that ethos from which that worldview emerges is about sustenance ultimately, and it's about resources and who has access. I mean, this is like a really materialist interpretation of the whole thing, but it seems like such an obvious dimension of this that that nobody else has mentioned. Like where's the incentive for the shift that you're talking about economically, and doesn't it imply a sort of like overhaul of the entire way that we think about like extracting and controlling and hoarding resources?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that's exactly right. I think the pet example is really good, right? Because you can say, well, why is it that we kind of treat our pets as people when we don't treat a lot of animals as people? And it's because we form a relationship with them, right? And so we can learn from that our understanding of personhood is informed really fundamentally by relations, right? As to the economic point, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And again, that's what for Viveiros de Castro, right? This attribution of personhood to other beings is bound up completely with relationships of predation, right? So in a sense, one of the reasons that the jaguar is seen as a person in the same way that humans see themselves as persons is because the jaguar hunts and eats other animals in the same way that humans hunt and eat other animals. And again, like he calls this cannibal metaphysics, because he looks at early European encounters with Indigenous Americans where they are described as practicing cannibalism, whether or not that was accurate is another question, but like, like if this exists, the way that it exists is because humans are able to not attribute personhood to other groups of humans precisely within the relationship of treating them as prey, right? Which ultimately would stem from an economic relationship, a relationship of sustenance and need, right? So yeah, I think like you ask, okay, well, where would this transformation come from, or would it entail sort of a complete restructuring of our economic system and the way that we do agriculture, right? I mean, I would say yes, absolutely, and in fact, that is the situation we are in, right? That is the situation that is being thrust on us in the climate change that we are experiencing, right? In the Anthropocene, right? Whereas there, you could say there will be a point soon. I would probably say that we're already at the point where if we don't completely restructure, right? So our economic systems and the way that we depend on destructive and exploitative agriculture, exploitative economic systems that are exploitative of other humans, of entire other countries, of continents of humans, right? We are going to survive, right? And so yeah, I mean, depending on how you look at it, you could say, well, what we're talking about here is all just superstructure on this on these economic arrangements, right? I'm of the approach that would say like these are things that we sort of have to work through at the same time. Both the discourse, the practical ontology, and the material economic structures. Yeah.
Which is a follow-up comment to that. I think that whole thing draws an interesting relationship between economic systems and religion, and the way we practice and think about religion that maybe people don't consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and let's thank Dr. Norton for the discussion today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're not here next Wednesday because it will be Thanksgiving break. But the last week of classes, we will have a discussion led by the director of yoga in prisons. Her name is Nicole Haldaller, and she'll be coming to talk about bringing yoga to prisons. So come for that at 4 o'clock on December 4th, Wednesday. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a good break.